Hello, I'm Georgina.
Hello, I'm Ruth.
Welcome to Minds Thrive.
Welcome back, Trevor Powell. We are here with the lovely Trevor Powell, esteemed colleague, clinical psychologist, published author. And today, Trevor, what are you talking to us about today?
I'm going to talk about autism and the development of civilization.
Wow.
Big topic.
Where'd you start?
Well, I suppose you start with the idea that there have always been autistic genes floating around in the gene pool, and that we've got a lot of examples today of autistic people who are shaping the world, scientists, businessmen, etc. But if we look back at the history of civilization, you look back at key people, often there's evidence of autistic traits in those people. So this autistic gene has had quite an impact on civilization. And in fact, the autistic lady Temple Grandin said very early on in her, she's written a number of books on autism, she made this point: the really sociable people probably didn't invent the first spear. It was probably invented by an autistic person chipping away at rocks while everybody else was socialising around a campfire, which I thought was a nice image, that, you know, people who like to socialise often aren't those people with intense focused interests who would rather be inventing a spear or the wheel or fire or whatever.
Who invented fire?
I'm not sure.
I think God was busy with that one.
Yeah. But the point she makes is a good one, I think. And therefore, if you look back throughout history, even going back to the ancient Greeks, if you look at reading something about Archimedes, who was a mathematician and engineer, who was so absorbed by his work that in the siege of Syracuse, where I think the Romans took over the Greek Empire, or don't quote me on that, but anyway, he was so obsessed with his work, a Roman soldier came in and Archimedes said, "Don't touch my circles or numbers." So the last thing he said was about his work, and the Roman soldier came in and stabbed him, and that was the end of Archimedes. But apparently that's the folklore, that he was right at the end, he was unconcerned about the battle that was going on. He was interested in his numbers and his circles. Same with Pythagoras, who was also a famous mathematician. Apparently he led or founded a community that had very strict rules and insisted on sameness as a kind of concept. You know, we get up at a particular time, everything is regimented and rule-based. So, and his interests were numbers and mathematics. So, you know, there might be a flavour of autism in Pythagoras. Pythagoras, the theory of Pythagoras. What is it?
We've gone from circles to triangles now, haven't we?
We vaguely remember it, Trevor, but we're having to go back.
It's something about a triangle.
The square of the hypotenuse on the right of the left of the two. You can tell that's not my own.
Okay, let's move on to Sir Isaac Newton.
There we go.
Another genius, astronomer, mathematician, Sir Isaac Newton, the solar system. Apparently, if you look at his history, he was very awkward in conversation, had very fixed, rigid schedules, was rather socially isolated, and intense interest in what was happening up there in space. Charles Darwin, the botanist who wrote The Origin of the Species and was the founder of evolutionary theory, was also a rather unsociable, quiet person who avoided social contact, apparently. And it's said of him, he preferred to communicate with writing rather than verbally.
I did not know this.
Well, this is all interesting stuff. And in fact, if you look at other historical figures like Thomas Edison, the man who invented the electric light bulb, Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the
Telephone.
very good.
Oh, it's like a pub quiz.
Their profiles are people who obsessively interested in their particular area, and would be upstairs in their bedroom trying to work out how an electric light bulb. In fact, I think the story about Thomas Edison was that he tried to patent the electric light bulb something like 800 times, and for 799 of them failed. It failed to be an electric light bulb, but he was persistent up until the end. And he said, no, I haven't failed. I'm just 799 times, I'm trying to get it right. So he didn't view it as a failure. It's kind of slightly autistic way of thinking, but good on him. So the electric light bulb, the telephone have changed the world. Now, there was an Australian professor called Alan Cinder from Sydney University who said Nobel Prize winning caliber geniuses often have certain autistic features at their heart. So, people throughout history, Newton, Darwin, Thomas Edison, geniuses, there's often an autistic flavour. And perhaps one of the main ones that he was referring to was Albert Einstein, Nobel Prize winning theory of relativity man who the story is that he didn't speak fluently until he was 7 years old, rarely mixed with his peers, was considered an odd boy, and as a child avoided light conversation and eye contact. But if something caught his interest, he had, in quotes, the concentration of a watchmaker, a laser-like ability to focus. Now, I think he was born in Austria. I think he was Austrian. Came to this country. Then he went to America. Got an academic post, but as a university lecturer, apparently was absolutely awful. He was rambling and confused, and was called Old Stoneface.
Oh dear.
Because of his lack of facial expressions. He was thought not to have a tactful manner, and said of himself, I'm not very good with people. But obviously, his skills were in other areas. Also, his lack of concern about his appearance. If you look at photographs of Einstein, he's got long hair, and he used to walk around without any socks on, which is, again, for people who are familiar with autistic people, that's it's not that uncommon.
There's a lot of boxes ticked in a diagnosis when you're saying that, isn't there?
Exactly.
It would be quite surprising if he wasn't.
Yeah, well, Simon Baron-Cohen, autism expert, I think wrote a paper on Einstein, and he did do a retrospective diagnosis. But one of the things that Einstein said was that, in fact, Einstein's brain, when Einstein died, the guy that did the autopsy put his brain in two big jars and put it on a shelf in his office. Didn't tell his family that it was taken from. But anyway, later on, when technological advances were such, his brain was analysed, and it was found that his left parietal lobe was bigger than normal. Now, that's the area where parietal lobe, it's visuospatial, it's thinking of images. And interestingly, Einstein said, thoughts don't come to me in words. I rarely think of things in words or language. It's images that come into my mind, and then afterwards I have the awkward problem of explaining to other people in words.
Wow. Oh, Trevor, that absolutely blows my mind, because I'm thinking about the amount of people I work with clinically who are autistic. And in therapy, when we talk about reasonable adaptations and how to adapt things, and so often in clinics, historically, the adaptations have been quite poor. It's like, oh, give them more sessions, give them less sessions, make it longer, make it shorter. But something I've found is there's something about communicating in different ways. So I'll draw things quite a lot. I'll map out when I'm talking about formulations. I'll draw things with people in a different way, and then use pictures and images. And I hadn't sort of made that connection, but there's something about communicating. It's not that there isn't stuff to be communicated. It's just that words sometimes perhaps aren't adequate for the imagery.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, Temple Grandin, who's written a number of books on autism, one of the books she wrote was about the autistic brain, and how even amongst autistic people, there are people that have pattern thinking, and there are people that are kind of verbal thinkers. She's a pattern thinker, so she can visualize. In fact, her claim to fame was she invented a new type of machinery for slaughterhouses in America, where the cattle were originally put through a series of chutes and passages that were very stressful for the cattle, because they didn't know what was coming next. And she was able to visualize what this was like for the cattle, and developed a system where the cattle could see where they were going much better. There's a film based on her work which brilliantly illustrates her ability to visualize, to put herself in the shoes of these cattle going down this chute, and how to create a more humane, less stressful type of abattoir. But no, so the point about Temple Grandin, she had her brain scanned, and she always thought what's the word? Metaphorically,
Yeah.
that there was a link between her visual cortex and the front of her brain, that she could visualize things much better than other people. Anyway, she had a number of MRI scans, and she found out that the left ventricle in her brain was much longer than normal people, and there were like lots of long neural pathways from the front of the brain right to the back of the brain. So she said it's not a metaphorical thing. I always imagined that my brain was like that, but in actual fact, when I looked at the scan, there it was in black and white. My brain was different.
Now, isn't that a lesson to doctors, clinicians, medical people, to listen to your patient? Because so often they do know things that are going on, and I'm talking across all neurotypes here, but how important it is to listen to people, because sometimes they have an insight or a knowledge or a sense that goes beyond a standard way of thinking about things.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And in fact, when a lot of autistic people with sensory issues will say, oh, it feels like, or if they're very sensitive to noise, that, it's not just, I can't stand the noise, it drives me mad. It's almost like, the connections in the auditory part of my brain, the too many connections. I hear the noise, it's like listening to it through a pair of loudspeakers, and actually, scanning an autistic person's brain, there's often an over-connection in those auditory areas of the brain.
Well, I'm Now we know what's going on, Ruth, because Ruth definitely has that.
I tell you what, Trevor, if a mouse farted 3 doors down, I'd hear it. I'm like that.
We were doing this online training, and she's like, "Oh, the noise! Can you hear that noise?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?"
Oh, really?
It later transpired that somebody was just rustling some papers, and I was like, "That's what she means."
Yeah.
But it's sort of, I've never seen it in anybody like I said in you, Ruth. It's extraordinary.
Right. It's interesting. Well, yeah, a lot of people that come along to see us will say, I can hear, not just a ticking clock or a fridge, the central heating, I can hear electricity. It's a condition called hyperacusia.
I can sometimes hear my blood pumping around my body.
Well, that's a good thing, isn't it? Once it stops, you'll be
You're
worried.
alive, yeah.
I can't hear it all the time, just when things are very still. I can hear that.
Yeah. Anyway, on with the history of famous people and civilization. So we've talked about Einstein. Next one I've got on my list is Alan Turing. Alan Turing?
Yes.
Coder?
He was a coder who cracked
we got a
the
point for the team.
Enigma code
Yes.
in the Second World War. And they made a film about him called The Imitation Game. Very interesting character. He was the founding father of modern-day computers. There's a thing called a Turing machine. Anyway, he cracked the Enigma code. Sadly, he committed suicide. He was homosexual, and in those days was punished for it and given kind of chemical castration, and absolutely dreadful story. But it's all in the film. Very good film. But he killed himself by eating an apple that was injected with cyanide. Now, Apple, computer company, his image, his icon is an apple with a bite out of it. And the story is that Steve Jobs, who founded Apple, was so enamoured with Alan Turing. There's a big picture of him on the atrium in the Apple headquarters. That image was the founding image of Apple computers. So that's a link. So Alan Turing, British mathematician, coder, scientist, who died, I think, in the late 50s, but was one of the founding fathers of modern-day computing. But modern-day computing has changed the way we live, probably more than anything else. Probably more than the telephone or the electric light bulb, maybe not as much, but in a similar way. Now, I read this book called Business for Aspies, written by a lady called Ashley Stamford, who was around in California at the time that Apple and Microsoft and all these companies were starting up. In fact, her husband was a coder, and apparently he was one of the best coders around, and was kind of found his own business, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't manage people. He was a backroom guy. He was a coder, and his wife recognised this, but she knew all the important people in California at the time. So she knew Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, and she said, and in her book she said, out of the 4 people who contributed most to building up the computer operating system, 3 were definitely autistic. So the 4 people were Linus Torvald, who was a Swedish guy who developed Linux operating system, Bill Gates, who developed Windows and Microsoft, and she said Steve Wozniak, who was the guy that worked with Steve Jobs in developing the Macintosh Apple system. She said the only one that wasn't autistic was Steve Jobs, who was quite a famous figure, quite a charismatic figure, perfectionistic, but she said no, he wasn't autistic, he just had a very difficult childhood. So that was a real insight. And in fact, recently Bill Gates wrote his autobiography, which people said the most interesting thing about it was right at the end of the book. He said, if I was a child today, I would be diagnosed as being autistic. He still rocks, he still fiddles, he has a very flat voice, He still has the ability to hyper-focus. He has all those traits. But, you know, his contribution to the world is enormous, and he recognises now that he would have been diagnosed.
Yes, he was in a BBC documentary recently,
Yeah.
and they went back to his childhood home,
Yeah.
and he showed us the bedroom that he used to climb out of his bedroom window at night to go back to school to go on the computers. It was just his absolute passion.
Yeah, yeah. So that was interesting, that there he was, he had this autistic brain, and someone gave him one of the first computers. The school that he went to had a very primitive computer, and he loved it, and he wanted to do it all the time. So yeah, you're right. He went back to school at 10 o'clock in the evening to work on his computer.
Yes. They also mentioned his mother, Trevor, and he described her as the crucible that kind of set his ambition alight, because she was also quite intense from what they described, and taking every opportunity to learn, and really invested in her children.
Right.
It was
Yeah.
fascinating.
I remember hearing him on Desert Island Discs a while ago, before he actually came out and said I'd be autistic, and he was saying, the interviewer was saying, well, when you started building up Microsoft, you know, there are all these stories about you rocking and not having very good personal hygiene, and he said, yeah, well, I was just so into it. He said, yeah, I used to just sleep under the desk, and the key thing he said, I knew the team that I worked with, I knew them. I knew every number plate in the car park. And I was just waiting for Kirsty Young to say, how many number plates was that, Bill? Because my guess is there were probably, 50 or 60 number plates, but he could remember those numbers. Most people, I can't even remember my own number plate.
No,
but,
I take a photo of my number plate every time I have to put it in those car park machines.
Now, the other person that's of great interest is Elon Musk.
Yes,
Now, often people say, oh, don't talk about Elon Musk. He's a very controversial figure. But before he got involved with Donald Trump and politics, he was quite a heroic figure, because he was running SpaceX, which is an independent rocket company, with his vision to put a man on Mars. He was running Tesla, the electric car company, and then he bought into Twitter, which is probably, in my view, his biggest mistake. But there's no doubt he was a genius. He had a particular type of brain. I remember reading things about him where he would employ these NASA engineers, and Elon Musk could explain how a rocket engine worked to these engineers and what he wanted them to do. And these experienced engineers would say, this kid's a genius. He actually understands it. He's the CEO, but he understands how a rocket works. He understands how an electric car works. So if you look at his history, he was dreadfully bullied at school in South Africa, but he could play chess. He could think of 14 moves ahead. And when he was something like 13, he developed a code, a computer coding system that he sold. I can't remember the details of it, but he was well advanced in that area: coding, computers, chess. Not very advanced in the kind of social and emotional world, bullied at school for being odd and different. And in fact, he came out, he was on Saturday Night Live about 7 or 8 years ago. It's an American comedy program on Saturday night. And he said something like, I'm the first autistic person to be on this show, which was not quite true. But he said, I've got a very flat intonation in my voice. My eye contact's not good. And I often say unconventional, controversial things. But hey, what do you expect from a guy who's going to put a rocket on Mars and has invented the electric cars? A normal, chilled out dude? I thought that was a great quote, and he certainly put himself in the frame there. But there are other people, like the guy that invented Pokemon, whose name is Satoshi Tajiri, he's autistic. Greta Thunberg has never hidden the fact that she's autistic, and she campaigned for environmental issues, won Times Woman of the Year in 2019.
I think that is just such a lovely conclusion, really, because as you were talking about all these people, I was hearing patterns and themes of adversity in childhood, which is quite common, not fitting in, feeling an outsider, not being conventional. And yet what you're exemplifying here is that that's okay, if you like. It's not nice. It's experiences that people have had, and in spite of that, they have gone on to contribute such enormous and helpful things to this world.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it is it's a common theme. Out of adversity comes something positive, and the history of autism and the effect of that autistic gene on civilization, out of those struggles with the social and emotional world has come, all these inventions and positive aspects.
Yeah, we all have a lot to thank autism for, regardless of our neurotype. So, Trevor, thank you yet again.
Thank you. Cheers.